Well, we come again tonight in our series of Women of the Bible, and we've come to see what we can learn from, one of the great women in the Old Testament, Ruth. And we're going to start by reading, the first part of the book, Ruth. So if we can pull that up on the screen. So Ruth, chapter 1, I'm going to read from verses 1 to 5. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the land of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left and her 2 sons. And they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and their husband. Now the name Ruth means a friend or companion. And as we go through our story tonight, we're going to see that very much that Ruth is a friend, particularly to Naomi, her mother-in-law. We saw in that first verse there that it takes place during the time of the judges. That's a fair period of time. But of course, it's that time that we're looking at. If, like certain people I know, you skip to the end of the book to find out what happens, you find that she's actually the grandmother, or the great-grandmother, of King David. So it puts her life around about the year 1100 BC. The story starts in the land of Moab. Moab, if you remember, was just on the east side of the Dead Sea, partway down by the River Arnon, and that's where it would start. It was a very fertile land, and that's why when there was a famine in Bethlehem, they went to this place because it was, very fertile. The people who lived there were Moabites. Moabites, of course, are related to the children of Israel. If you remember, 3 weeks ago, we were talking about Lot's wife. And when we were thinking about Lot's wife, we remembered having come out of, Sodom. Lot was turned to a pillar of salt because she turned back. But the 2 daughters went on with, Lot. And we also heard how wicked the 2 daughters were. They got their father drunk. They went, laid with him, and they both had children. And one of them, the oldest daughter, had a son called Moab, which means he is of my father. Related, they are actually enemies through most of the time, when we read about them. If you remember, it's a while ago now, we're just talking about the children of Israel coming out of the wilderness. They couldn't go through Moab. They went round it. But Balak, the king, decided he didn't want it, and he hired a man, Balaam, to curse Israel. And then when that didn't work, he sent, as it were, some of the younger ladies of Moab into the camp, and that caused the people in the camp to commit adultery and start to worship false gods. Eglon, another king of Moab, came and oppressed Israel 18 years until God raised up another man, Ehud, left-handed, to kill him and also to defeat the Moabites. They were the enemies of God. They were pagan. They worshipped false gods. Baals, Ashtaroths, but particularly one called Chemosh. And of course, because of their wickedness, God had put them off limits, as it were, to the children of Israel, not to marry. But of course, we've read here tonight, haven't we, that Mahlon actually married Ruth. Why was that? Well, we're not actually told, any of the reasons why. What was the motivation? Was it just purely he wanted a wife? Or was it that she had maybe faith, just like Rahab did? We heard about her last week. She was a Canaanite living in a wicked country as well, but she had faith. We're not told. What we do know is by the end of those 10 years in which they were in Moab, both Ruth and Orpah wanted to go back with Naomi. There's that great connection between the three of them at this point. But of course, Naomi thought, no, it's going to be hard. 2 Moabites living in this country, very difficult for them. And so she said, no, go back. Go return each to your mother's house, and the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. They've been good to her. And she said for them to go back, but they said, no, we want to stay with you. So she then had to tell them all about the problems, what would be if they went back. And of course, one of the problems which she speaks about there is the Mosaic laws regarding, remarriage. And the whole idea would be that you would marry your brother or your husband's brother, so that way the line would be carried on. And of course, she didn't have one, or he didn't have one. Mahlon didn't, because he had died as well. And of course, that caused big problems. Where would they get a husband? All those sorts of things. And so what we find there is that Orpah decides the cost really is too much, and she decides to go back. Too much to go on and to serve the living God. And what we're told there, as we read on there, in verse 15, it says, Luke, your sister has gone back to her people, to her gods. Yes, there was a love there for Naomi, but not that much of a love for God or for his people. But that's not true when we start talking about Ruth. Ruth in verse 16, she says this, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me also, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. What was she saying? Your God will be my God. She was saying there that the people of God, that's where she wants to be. She wants to be there under the protection of God himself. She will not go back. She doesn't want, Naomi to keep trying to persuade her to. She wants to stay. She wants to go and be with God's people. She shows some faith here in what she's doing, wanting to be under the protection of God. She takes an oath in those words as well. The Lord do so to me, and more also. She's very serious about this. She wants the God of Israel to be her God, the people of Israel to be her people. And at the same time as saying that, what she's also saying is, the people who I used to be with, they've gone. That manner of life has gone. The gods that they served, I used to serve, I don't serve anymore. Very much a little picture in one sense of when a person becomes a Christian. God is who they want to be with, and not the old gods which they would serve. And the people of God are those that they want to spend time with. and not those who would cause them to turn away from God. So there we are. She has gone back with Naomi back to the land. And there in the land, she shows something more about her character. If you look at verse 2 of chapter 2, what you find there is she says this. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, please let me go to the fields, glean the heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favour. One of the ways which the poor people could get food and work was to go into the field of another person, and they were allowed to go, and anything that dropped on the floor, and they were cutting the corn or barley down, they could pick up and they could have. That was theirs. That was the law. That was what was said in the law. I think the corners as well, they would have to leave, and she would be able to go and do that. Not the easiest job, but she was willing to go and do that. It wasn't something which she was thinking, well, no, it's a bit below me to do that type of work. She was willing to do what she needed to do to help support Naomi. She asked permission of her mother-in-law. There's that relationship with her. Sometimes you look at the relationship today between mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and it's not always good. Sometimes it's like, butting heads together. This is the way I do it, and that's the way you do it. Not so here. Very much, she looks upon her as her mother and Naomi as her daughter, and there's that great relationship, friendship between them. She gets permission, and then she goes out, and it's a great verse, number 3. It says, she went and gleaned in a field after the reapers, and she happened to come across the part of the field that belonged to Boaz. It's one of those great statements, and it happened. But of course, nothing happens by chance. God is in control of all things, and he has brought her to that field for a particular purpose. And as the story goes on, we're going to see just how much God is in control of all things. He's working all things out for the good of his people, for the glory of his name. There she is, Boaz's field. She's working. Boaz arrives, and we see in verse 5, Boaz notices this young lady working in the field. He wants to know, who is it? So he goes up and he speaks to the foreman who's looking after all the other workers, and he asks him, and he says, whose young woman is this? And then in verse 6, the servant, he gives his reply, and it's a great reply. He starts off by saying, this is the young woman, the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. So he says a little bit about her so he knows who it is. And then he goes on to say, when she came, she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Now this is something which she was able to do. The law had said that. But it's not like I'm going to claim my rights here. I'm just going to go and do it. Very courteous, polite. She goes and she asks permission. And of course, she's given permission. And then it goes on and it says, and she came and she continued from morning until now, though she rested a little bit in the house. Something else we see about her as we look at her life, she was a hard worker. She got up early, started the work, and she worked right through, as it were. So slight, little rest in the middle of the day, most likely the sun at its hottest, and most people would have gone in and rested at that point. She's only gone in for a short time before she goes back out working again. Great work ethic that she has. And she's out there working again. And of course, when Boaz starts to hear about her character, what she's like, he's impressed. And so he calls her over and he speaks to her and he shows some great favour to her. He says to her, to stay in the field. His fields, don't go off to other people's fields. He allows her to take a drink from, his, water that's been supplied by him, and so on. And he makes sure his young men don't go pestering her. Shows great favour. And something else then comes out. We see in verse 10. When the favour is shown to her, it's not taken for granted. She falls down on her face, bowed to the ground and said, "Why have I found favour in your eyes, that you should take notice of me since I'm a foreigner?" She was a Moabitess, one of the enemies of God, and she wasn't expecting, great things from the people, but he's shown great favour. She shows her humility, and she recognises that she's undeserving of all of this. But of course, what she is doing is something which is good. And he's also heard more. Look in verse 11, and it says, "It's been fully reported to me what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how that you left your father and mother, the land of your birth, and have come to a people who you did not know before." People talk about each other, don't we? And of course, that's what had been going on there. Whether that be in the open, have you heard about Ruth or Naomi? She's back. Have you heard about Ruth? And it's a good report that's given. The man who was in charge, the foreman, he had given a good report. Other people who, Boaz had met, they'd given a good report. That's what we should be like as well. We should have a good report of everyone who meet us, whether that's, in our workplace. We're not just lazy, doing as little as we can. We should be there working hard. It should be something which is reported by them. In the family, they should look upon us, and have a good report. In the church, when people see us, they should come and give a good report of the people. We represent God in this world, and we, like Ruth, should have a good report given to us when people talk about us. And it's a great shame when, we hear that justly, maybe sometimes things are said which do not give a good report. We need to be people of a good character who do things for the glory of God in all of our lives and how we live. And that's why he showed favour, because of a good report that she had. But he didn't just want his favour to be shown to her, he wanted God. Look at verse 12. "The Lord repay you full reward given by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to find refuge." She hadn't just come back, to Israel, to be with, Naomi. She had come because she wanted to be under the wing of God, God's protection, God's care, of the grace of God upon her life. That's why she was there. And he wanted God to bless her. Very much, undeserving. This is how she feels. She's just a maidservant. No one important, not even one of his maidservants, to get this, given. So there she is, back in the field. Boaz gives even more. He tells his workers, when you're going round, drop a little bit extra. When you cut the barley, pick it up and take it. The women then wrap it up. Just make sure you drop a little bit more. And of course, by the end of the day, she would have quite a bit. But before the end of the day, we find actually it's a meal time. And Boaz invites her. And when she's having the meal, he gives some parched grain. We read about that. She doesn't eat it all. Yes, she's filled, but she's got some left over. And she's already thinking about what she should do with it. She's thinking about Naomi. And she's going to save it, for her mother-in-law to make sure that she has something, to eat as well. Very much a woman who cares for and thinks about other people, as it goes on. So at the end of the day, all this stuff she's got, she beats it to just the grain. And at the end of it, we're told she had 1 ephah of barley. That would be enough for both of them for around about 6-7 days. Quite a lot for one day's work. And her mother-in-law notices it. And of course, she wants to know, whose field have you been in? And so she tells him. And so she says, well, go back to his field tomorrow and the day after. And she did that right through, to the end of the harvest. And while she's doing that as well, she mentions to her that actually he is one of our close relatives. Why? Because when we move on to chapter 3, we're going to see that Naomi is going to do her matchmaking business. And she says to her daughter-in-law there in verse 1, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Naomi's desire is that Ruth would have the security of the marriage to a man who is able to look after her, protect her, provide for her. That's her desire. And of course, she's thinking about marriage. And of course, she then goes on to say to Ruth, this is what you must do. And she gives the instructions, put your best dress on, get yourself washed and all ready to go. And when you get there, watch where he lies when he goes to sleep at night, and then just lie at his feet. And then when he wakes up, you speak to him. Ruth is one, she listens to what is being said, and she does what is being said. You see that there, all that you say to me, I will do. And then in verse 6, she went down the threshing floor, and did according to all that her mother-in-law had instructed her. So of course, when night comes, Boaz had gone, he'd laid down by the heap of grain, make sure really nobody else comes along and takes any. So he's there to protect it. And then he wakes up partway through the night, midnight, and somebody's at his feet. So he's startled, and he says, who is it? Who are you? And then Ruth says, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. What's she actually saying? Basically, it's almost a proposal for marriage. She's saying, take me as your wife. And he knows that. And I think the first thing which he says there in verse 10 is this: blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, for you have not gone after the young men, whether rich or poor. Ruth knew, her duty, as it were, to raise up somebody to carry on the line of Mahlon and Elimelech. And she wanted to do what the law says. Didn't go chasing the other young men or anything like that. Boaz was in the line able to do that. But he goes on to say, not the closest. Now, the other thing which comes over here is to remember that Boaz is not a young man himself. I think the Jews believed that he was most likely about 80 years old at this time. An older man. And, he sees what she's saying to him, and he sees just how good a person she is. He goes on, and he says to her, "My daughter, do not fear. I will do all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you're a virtuous woman." He knew she was a virtuous woman. Everyone else did. Everyone's got a good report of her by her life, by what she does. About 5 weeks ago, I think it was, Sunday morning, we were looking at Proverbs 31. And we believe that passage was written, for King Solomon. And very much so, here is a woman who is a virtuous wife, the person that you would want to marry. And that's, laid down in, Proverbs 31, the qualities. Ruth shows those qualities in her life. But of course, there is one problem. Boaz is not the closest relative. There's one other. And so he says he's going to have to deal with it and sort out, before he can, as it were, say, "Yes, I will marry you." So he's concerned about her, her name. So he says, "Look, before it gets too late, get up and go back home so people can't see." People do have that, seeing something and making things up, and he didn't want, anyone to be saying anything which was wrong. She's done nothing wrong in what she had done. But sometimes people do, come up with their ideas and think the worst. So she goes home. Naomi's there, and Naomi's waiting for her to come in. "Is that you?" And then, of course, she goes on in that verse, "Tell me everything. Tell me what happened." And Ruth goes through everything that went on. And as she goes through everything, Ruth is there, and Naomi's there, should I say. And Naomi's pleased. But in verse 18, she says, "Sit still, my daughter, until the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest till he has concluded the matter today." I actually think Naomi needed to sit still and keep her feet on the ground as well, because I think she was, this is great. He's going to go and marry, her daughter-in-law. She looked upon her very much as a daughter as well. So it is that the story, Boaz goes to the gate. He wants to sort out a legal issue. And so he calls over the closer relative. He calls over another 10. So they got quorum. And he tells them about the land that Naomi has sold or is to sell. And he says the close relative is the one who should, buy that land, redeem it, for them. And of course, as he's thinking about this, he's thinking about himself. And so he says, "Oh yes, I'll redeem the land." But of course, it isn't just a matter of redeeming the land. In verse 5 of chapter 4, he says, "On the day you buy the land from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." That makes a big difference to this man. And so he says no, because you see, he knows it's of no benefit to him. In fact, it might even be to the detriment, of him and his existing family. And so he declines and he says, you can redeem. And Boaz does redeem them. And of course, Boaz calls upon everyone who's there to witness, what's gone on, that he has bought all that Elimelech had and all that Chilion and Mahlon had from the hand of Naomi. But moreover, Ruth, verse 10, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as a wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through the inheritance. He was now going to marry her. And in verse 13, we see that Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. When he went into her, the Lord gave conception, and she bore a son. Very often we'd think today, of just, it's all natural, it just happens. But we really do need to remember that when we have children, they are a gift of God. It is God at work in this, creating a new life in us. And we need to give God thanks. And then verse 14, the women, they go up to Boaz, or to Naomi, and they say, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative. May his name be famous in Israel, and may he be to you a restorer of life and another share in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better than you, for you than 7 sons has borne him." That's something which is great, isn't it? To say of a woman, just how great your daughter-in-law was. And then, of course, we go on and we find that this son is called Obed. Years later, he would have another son called Jesse. And then Jesse would have a son called David. And of course, jumping forward nearly 1,000 years, Christ himself would come from that line. And we read last week, didn't we, about Rahab? And we read how she was in the line, a Canaanite woman in the line of Christ, now a Moabite woman in the line of Christ. Actually, she's Boaz is Rahab's daughter, is Rahab's son. And you see God at work, God blessing his people. As you go through that passage, we've gone through it very quickly. A lot of things there which we need to remember about Ruth. Once she was an enemy of God, of God's people. But God brought her into his family to be one of his people. She was a woman who gave up her old life, the old things that she used to do, the gods that she used to worship. And she's now worshipping the true God. She has faith in the true God. She's obedient to his laws, the customs of the day, and she was seeking to do what God wanted in her life. Legally, she was lost, but now she's redeemed. The price was paid, not just for the land, but for her as well. She was redeemed, and she was greatly blessed of God. If you think about some of her character, a virtuous woman, that's the thing which comes across very much in this. Very respectful to her mother-in-law and to other people. Thankful for what she was given. Not, "Well, no, that's my right. I have that by, it's my right." Hardworking, diligent. She was loyal, kind, thoughtful for other people. She had sacrificial love. It was hard, but she did it. She was one who was obedient to her mother-in-law, great devotion to her, and she had a good reputation amongst everybody who she had met. People who had heard about her thought well of her. Yes, she had a hard life, but she didn't moan about those sort of things. She got on with it, and she did what she could, to move things forward in a way which will be honouring to God. And then, of course, we need to remember that as we look at her life, we need to remember that God is there in it. It just happened that she went to this field. God had his plans for her life, and God was going to fulfill that plan and see that it came about in a good way. A lot of things we can learn from her life, and we need to look at our own lives, don't we? And to ask, are we the people of God that we ought to be? If we look at some of those characters in her life, You know, are people going to say of us, that's how we are, you know, the way we live? You know, a great example, you know, to how we ought to be living and the sort of things we should do. Well, we're going to sing another hymn. I will sing of my Redeemer. We thought very much about, you know, Boaz being the Redeemer, but Christ is our Redeemer. So we're going to sing now. I will sing of my Redeemer and his wondrous love to me.